This video is now in session, and there are people who don't know the entirety of the three branches of government and how our government works, which it might be pretty surprising because a lot of these systems are incredibly famous in the United States, but nonetheless, there are still people who don't know a lot of these different parts of government, especially the judicial branch. So in this video, we're gonna go over all of the branches of government, including the separation of powers between the three branches, and as well as the state and the federal governments, because there are two parts to this system. So, starting at the very top, we have two kinds of government. We have a federal government and a state government. So, a federal government manages the entire nation. The state government manages their state. And a state, which really should be known, but a state is a part of a land within the United States. And they have their own government, and then they also have some additional rules in addition to national rules. So there are a total of 50 states in the United States. There are also territories. I believe there are 6 major territories in addition to the 50 states, including Washington, D.C. But we're not going to go over those in this video because territories are not super important to government. I mean, a territory is not allowed to really vote for a presidential candidate, not except in the primaries, not able to vote for a senator to represent them, maybe a shadow senator or a shadow representative, but not a real representative or a real senator that can vote for bills. And the only thing that they have is like a small government. So anyway, and we're not going to really talk about them in this video. We've made a lot of videos about territories and whether or not they should become the United States. So go watch those if you want to know a little bit more about territories. And for the federal government, there are 3 branches. There are the executive. Let's start from the top. So the point of the federal government is to make laws and is to make policy. So we start at the legislative branch. The legislative branch is the branch that makes the laws, that crafts them, that literally writes them. And there are 2 parts to this legislative branch. There is the Senate and the House of Representatives. And the reason why there are 2 and not 1 is because the Founding Fathers decided on a bicameral system. Not the Founding Fathers, but a collective group of Americans decided on a bicameral system rather than a unicameral system. A bicameral system is an institution with 2 chambers. That's why you have bi in front of cameral. So the House of Representatives is meant to be proportional to the population of a state. Meanwhile, for the U.S. Senate, that is supposed to stress equality. So there was a debate during the founding of the nation as to whether the United States should be, the legislative government should be based on population or based on state boundaries. And ultimately what was decided in the Great Compromise was to have both in a bicameral system, so that you have an institution that is based on representation, but also an institution that's based on equality. So with that, there are 2 parts to the legislative side, and it was actually at that time, it was a debate between New Jersey and Virginia. New Jersey at that time was one of the smallest states, while Virginia was the biggest state in the Union. So that's the first branch. They create laws. It first has to pass through the House of Representatives, and usually a bill starts at the very bottom at a committee in the House of Representatives. It can also come from the Senate though, but we'll just say the House of Representatives to make it simple. So a committee in the House of Representatives votes on a bill, and then they go to the House of Representatives, the full chamber, in order to see if it passes with a majority of the vote. Now, when it comes to putting bills into session, you don't have to put it in a committee, but most of the times bills are put in committees. So they go through a committee and then they go through the full chamber, and then if they pass the chamber, it goes over to the Senate. You only need 50% of the members present, or I guess the members in quorum, in order to vote, in order to pass a bill, I mean. And then from there, after the House of Representatives, it gets sent to the Senate, where it could go through a committee. Sometimes it does. A lot of times it doesn't. But it goes through the full. It goes through the full body, just like the House of Representatives. The only difference is that you need 60 votes, 3/5 of the Senate, but more accurate, I guess, 60 votes in order for a bill to pass the Senate, and that is through the process of filibustering. Well, it's not really filibustering, but per se, but it's the origins of how America keeps talking about the filibuster, where you have a rule that you need 60 votes in order to pass a bill, or else it will be filibustered. And there are people today who are discussing about removing the filibuster and being more like the House of Representatives, where majority rules. But nonetheless, let's just say that the bill passes through the legislative session. The next place it goes to is the executive branch. The executive branch is primarily the president, but it's not only the president. And what they do is mainly sign bills and as well as coordinate policy. So the executive branch at the very top is the U.S. president, the most well-known figure of the entire world. And then you also have cabinet members. There are many cabinet members. There are many cabinet members in the executive branch. And the cabinet members include one vice president, 15 officers, and they mainly are in charge of the departments of the United States, and then you also have 9 other members. So with those 15 officers, they are all belonging to a department of the U.S. government, and they are, for the most part, called secretaries, with the exception of the Department of Justice, where they are called the Attorney General. It used to be called something different. Originally speaking, they were called Secretary. The Secretary of State, Secretary. They used to be called something different, but nowadays it's called the Attorney General, just because the people who were in this position started to make the Department of Justice sound special and fancy, so that's why we use the AG name instead of, I believe, the Secretary of War, but I'm not quite sure. Nonetheless, the AG position is used today. And then we also have the Secretary of State that manages foreign relations. Secretary of Treasury deals with money. Secretary of Defense deals with the world affairs, foreign affairs, and as well pertaining to battles and combat. And then the Attorney General is the person who manages the Department of Justice, which prosecutes and brings cases against individuals and as well as corporations. The Secretary of the Interior is in charge of America's federal land. You have the Secretary of Agriculture, which deals with food. Secretary of Commerce, which deals with science and as well as transportation and the interconnectedness of American society. And then the Secretary of Labor, which deals primarily with labor, but no, it deals with working conditions. You also have the Health and Human Services Secretary, which deals with health, and then the Secretary of the HUD, the Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Education, Veterans Affairs, Homeland Security, and then you also have the rest of these positions. You have a trade representative, director of national intelligence, director of OMB, director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and then you have the administrator of the EPA and the SBA. So those are the main positions of the United States cabinet. They include the vice president as well as the cabinet members, or secretary members, I guess, and other offices. So you have the president and then you have the cabinet. So those two meet together, but the president is the main person who decides whether a bill should be passed or not. And once it does pass, let's just say it does pass, woohoo, then it becomes law. But let's just say it doesn't pass, then the legislative branch can veto that veto. They can override the president's veto if there is a 2/3 majority in order to surpass it. And those kinds of vetoes have been done before. They're relatively rare these days because of partisanship, but back then they were a lot more common. So now that a bill becomes law, what is the third branch? The third branch is the judicial branch, and they check to see if practically check to see if that law is constitutional, if it abides by rules, and if members who are creating the laws don't abuse their powers when doing so. So there are three parts to the judicial branch. There's the Supreme Court, which everyone should know about. There's also the appeals court, which is the middle tier of the three courts, of the three musketeers. So you have the appeals court, or it's more formally known called the U.S. Court of Appeals. And then finally, you have the U.S. District Courts. The District Courts are at the very bottom of the chain, and the main reason why there are three, where there are three categories rather than just one, it's mainly so that as you get higher up the chain, you get different opinions, but more importantly, you can start to narrow the field into important cases that have to be decided. Obviously, every single case does have some importance, but some cases need to go to the Supreme Court. Other cases don't really need to go to the Supreme Court, especially those that don't really deal with the Constitution. The Supreme Court usually almost always deals with constitutional issues. So if you don't have a constitutional issue and you happen to be in the federal court system, then you'll most likely go through the district court. You might even go through the Court of Appeals, but you're definitely almost definitely, I wouldn't say 100% not, but almost definitely not going to go to the Supreme Court. And that's just meant to make sure that the constitutional cases have as much insight as possible into constitutional cases. So those are the three branches of government. Also with the federal judiciary, there are in terms of the appeals court. If we can go to the appeals court, for an appeals court, no, this is not the Court of Appeals. There are multiple districts for the appeals court. If we go to the United States, the Court of Appeals, you can see that for the U.S. map, there are different parts. There are multiple Court of Appeals. It's not just one. The Supreme Court is the highest court of the land, but for the Court of Appeals, there are multiple versions of them. They are separated into circuits. There are a total of 13 circuits, so the 1st through the 9th, and it goes through the United States. There are multiple Court of Appeals because they deal with a lot of cases, so having one nationwide court would not really be that, it would make the system too it would make the system too complex, rather than having 9 different systems where you can have 9 different sections of the United States, and you have judges who are more suited to deal with with one of those circuits rather than dealing cases nationally. So you have the 9 circuits, and then you also have DC, the DC circuit, and the federal circuit. So the federal circuit is actually the most valuable out of the 13 in terms of constitutional law, because most constitutional cases go through the federal circuit. The DC circuit is also pretty good at that. The DC circuit also frequently deals with a lot of antitrust cases because there you have a lot of people who are prosecuting companies from the DC circuit, but you can also go through the other circuits as well. And then you can see these little lines within some of these states, and they're mainly there as district courts. The district courts, there are even more district courts than the Court of Appeals, than appeals courts. You can see that each state has at least one, to my knowledge, and some states have more than one. You can see that Texas is separated into 4. Meanwhile, New Mexico only has 1. And this and how this was built was based on population primarily. Now, it's not as even as the Electoral College, where it gets changed every 10 years. This kind of system rarely gets changed at all, just because if you want to change the system, that usually goes too much into politics. But nonetheless, the proportion doesn't matter quite as much as the legislative side and the executive side with the electoral system, and as well as the House of Representatives. But they do have somewhat proportional systems. You can see that Virginia has 2, New York has 4. Meanwhile, Massachusetts has 1. So that's the federal. Those are the federal court systems, and this is replicated towards the state side. So you have as much separation of powers as possible, and you have separate systems for different issues, because sometimes the state is better at dealing with certain things than the federal government, and vice versa. So just imagine if this was replicated to the state side, with the exception of Nebraska. Nebraska only has a unicameral legislative branch. They don't have a bicameral system. And then in terms of the judicial branch, there is a state Supreme Court, but in terms of these lower courts, it can vary widely among different states. Some states don't have a Court of Appeals, some states do, and then some states have different kinds of courts that don't quite deal with specific things. You also have municipal courts and city courts, so there is a lot more complexity into state courts, but it's there so that judges can deal, so that the best judges can deal with a lot of cases that they know about, that they can prosecute or not prosecute, that they can determine. So those are the two governments and the 3 branches. They're meant to check on each other so that when so that policy can get passed in the United States that follows the Constitution, and as well as other appropriate laws. So that's the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.